Hello out there! Welcome to another AutoCrit Live. Today we're going to talk about names. I feel like doing the name game. It's like Daniel, Banana, if you know that one. But we're going to talk about how to name your characters. This can be a place in your writing where you can struggle. You can get really hung up on it. And so we're going to give you some tools, some tricks to stir up your thinking, give you some ideas on how to get past that choice and narrow it down from the endless possibilities. So I am joined here with Gareth.
Hello.
Yes. And what we want to hear from you throughout this session are some of your ideas. What are some of your favorite names that you've come up with, or maybe some names you've really liked in literature or other, entertainment works? What are some of the tricks that you use to name your characters yourself? It'll be fun. We have a combination of kind of some fun and quirky things you can do, plus different methods that you might use for naming your characters. So we have people from all over here, Florida, Pennsylvania, Texas, Charleston. He says greetings from Texas, but don't call me Tex. I like that. It's a way to name your character, right? Name place. So that being said, we'll just kind of go through these tips and tricks. And as I said, if you can think of examples as we go through, or different tips and tricks you do, please share them in the comments. I'd love to hear about them. All right. So what do we have first? The origin story. Using the origin of your character to determine their name. Gareth, you're the one who gave me this tip. What were you getting at specifically with talking about an origin story?
Yeah, I think some of these. This is probably the simplest. I think many of these kind of methods or tips that we'll give today are kind of like Daniel said earlier, designed to be a sort of springboard for you. That's like my favorite word for a lot of this creative stuff, right? Is a springboard that you can use to jump off and find different ideas. Just places to start from. And of course, the easiest place to start with any kind of character is their origin story. And that's just a clever way of saying, where were they born? Where do they come from? When were they born? I think the easiest way to come up with something like this is when you have your character's history and you're like, okay, they were born in this region and they were born in this year. Nowadays, thanks to the internet, it must have been way, way, way harder in the past. But nowadays, we've got the wonders of Google. You can search online for things like what were popular baby names in that place during that period. And the same for surnames. Look for what are common surnames. Surnames aren't generally too much of an issue because they survive for a long, 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 long time. Kind of a lot of modern surnames are just permutations of historical surnames that are largely the same, and some modern surnames are exactly the same as they were, hundreds of years ago. But when it comes to the first name, literally Google popular baby names during this period in this place, and I think you'd be surprised at some of the ones that come up. And then you're looking through and finding out what fits.
That makes a lot of sense. The nice thing about that kind of shorthand too is that since we have a general idea of names and origins and things like that, more than likely if you're picking a typical name for that place and time, essentially you're going to be kind of signposting or whatever your work in that way, right? Or that character. So if somebody comes over and they say they're whoever, you might get an idea of what time and place we're at just by the name itself, if you're picking a very standard sort of typical name for the time frame. So that's really smart. I know one thing that comes into play when writing historical fiction can be that you have to understand also what the audience expectation is, right? They call it, I've heard it called the Tiffany effect, because the name Tiffany actually does date back quite a ways. But if you put it in a historical fiction, a lot of times people are like, well, Tiffany, that sounds like an 80s name. And it's really not. Yeah. It just became more popular later, right? And so, but because that's the audience perception, you're probably best to avoid it simply because that's what they think, right? And they're going to think you made a mistake. So it's probably the same thing too. If you're thinking the origin story, you may want to be careful, because if you go too unusual, they're like, well, I've never met anybody from that area called that. That doesn't ring true at all. So that's another good reason to do your research.
That's where I think beta readers come in handy as well.
Yeah.
People that look at it and go, the name feels a little off for me. If two or three people tell you that, yeah, think about changing it.
Social status of the character. That's an interesting idea. You could even look up maybe who some of the wealthier people were of the era or something, perhaps. Obviously, you don't necessarily want to lean too much into celebrity, because then you might start to sound like historical fiction if you're not even intending to. But you might get an idea, on things like that. Sure.
Yeah, certainly. But that kind of thing as well, just built into that comment, including the social status of the character, is, for example, yeah, you might want to, if they're high class, not, in kind of modern times anyway, look back through history in that
Yep.
area, look at the names of the rulers, whether if it's a feudal society, look back through the whole royal family lines, the kind of names they were using and how to describe to each other. And you could even just pick one that's way down the line, that
Yep.
won't ring any bells with modern people, but put that into the current day character, because it will carry a through line.
Yeah, I mean, I think in modern times, there's famous wealthy people, for example, Elon Musk, who has very avant-garde name for his kids, right? In ways that other people wouldn't try to do, partly because they would be concerned about the social stigma. But obviously, when you have a lot of money, you don't have to be as concerned about that, right? So that sort of stuff does change over time, for sure.
Yeah. A lot of the time, I think, well, one of the tips that I could say won't be among all the ones today is flip over a Scrabble board and pick a name from whatever is still face up. But yeah, people still do it today. You've seen all sorts of crazy
I
examples.
mean, there was that young adult series, the selection with America Singer, and everyone's like, wow, that's really on the but it was a bestseller. So you can maybe think, that's not for me, but it worked for the audience. So just saying.
Yep.
You can never quite discount a choice. All right. What about the first sound or letter? This is something that I think that you need to keep in mind when naming your characters. A common problem can be that characters sound very similar to each other. A classic example of this is when Tolkien has Sauron and Saruman, which is one reason why in the animated one they changed it to Ahriman. Obviously, Peter Jackson respected the work more than that. But even so, I did speak to a lot of people after seeing the movie, and they were very confused. And you could say, well, they should get over it. But what Tolkien was doing actually was correct, in that is the way language tends to work, that we tend to have a lot of similar sounding names. But for the purposes of your audience tracking your characters, you're often not well suited doing that. Now, that doesn't mean you can never do it. You might do it for an intentional reason. But it's a dodgy thing to do, is to have too much replication of sounds. And I think there's actually some editors that will basically just not allow it. At least I've heard that. Have you ever come across that, Gareth?
Yeah, on occasion.
Yeah. The other thing you can keep in mind too is just what it sounds like, right? What is the way that the sound rolls off your tongue? Obviously, certain sounds, and I always forget the term for this, but there are certain sounds that have a harsher sound, like a k and a p and a t, which is softer, or a softer sound like a l, or and you might want to have a harsher character with a k sound, because it just comes across that way, right? So that's something to keep in mind too, is just how it sounds. That can be a factor. Have you ever named a character because of that? I have.
Yeah, sometimes I like to have, especially when it comes to villainous characters, you want a harsh sound at the end, like a k, like you said, or ending with a t. Something like Kuntz as well, because that has a nice beat to it. It feels more forceful than less forceful names. And like you said, with the first sound of the letter of the character's name as well, this can be especially something to keep your eye on when it comes to naming fantasy characters as well, because I'm not sure if we'll mention it a bit later today, but always keep in mind, I think it kind of goes on said, that the names of your characters should be easy to pick up as fast as possible. And having a lot of strange, ZX, for example, in fantasy or extreme sci-fi, where you've got all these different alien races and things that have crazy names, don't make them too crazy, or people won't be able to interpret them and really understand as quickly as possible. And that can go as far as even just names like Xavier, with starting with an X. talk to anybody about X-Men nowadays, and half the people will say Dr. Xavier, and the other half will say Dr. Xavier. The totally different pronunciations.
It's true. Yeah, so keep that in mind too. J.K. Rowling faced this with Hermione because it was an unusual enough name that people didn't know how to pronounce it. So she actually put the pronunciation in the book. In the fourth book, Hermione helps somebody pronounce her name. Apparently, her favorite answer was Hermy1. Somebody came up and they said, "I love Hermy1," and she was like, "I almost didn't want to correct them because it was so sweet." If somebody's pointing out Robert Jordan, his love of names starting with E. I didn't want to call that out, but yes, that is a famous example of an author maybe overdoing it with a single letter. Although, I mean, it's a classic, so can you really bash it too much? I do love this comment too. If writing romance, always remember how the name will sound in the heat of passion. That's a very good point that I actually hadn't thought of before, because I've never written a scene like that. But yeah, oh, Elmer doesn't sound great with the passionate voice. There was an old cartoon I watched with Elmer the elephant. So that's all I think of when I think of, oh, Elmer. It sounds like an old-fashioned name, right?
I think of Elmer Fudd in compromising situations, and that's not an image I wanted.
Yeah,
today,
that's not good either. So either way, it doesn't tend to work. And I'm sorry if your name is Elmer. I apologize. I'm not mocking your name. Well, maybe a little bit, but no, I'm just that's just my my reaction to it. And this goes to personal experience, right? Obviously you can't help it, but you name everybody's probably experienced where there's a character with a name and it matches somebody they really don't like, and so then they have to kind of get over that. That's always fun. Little aside. Okay, what about baking in an allegory? How would you do this with a name? I'm very intrigued, Gareth.
This is one of my most fun methods of kind of doing it and looking for things. And we had an example of something I would like to point out. And let me get back up to it here. For example, pulling some inspiration from allegorical things. Wendy looking for words, Arista having to do with bees, and pulling Doyle from Arthur Conan Doyle. So it's more along the lines of the first one, Arista. Sorry about my dog going nuts. But there's a lot of different areas you can come at this from, but it's essentially using terminology that you take from elsewhere that references the character's role in the story, kind of what they're going to be getting up to, their character archetype, sort of who they're playing in the major role of this stuff, or little elements of their personality. And you can do it in many, many different ways. Like the first one, for example, is look at other story structures. If you're telling a tragic tale like an Icarus rise and fall, and it seems to fit into that Icaristic mold, but you're transporting it to a whole other setting and different characters. Maybe you call your character Wings, like that's their first name, like Wings Hauser, the actor. Or you can take elements of the pronunciation of Icarus. I have just written a few examples here to remind myself. For example, Icarian could be a fantasy version. Ichabod, like Ichabod Crane, and it could be a period version. Even nowadays, you have names like Nicholas, which would be modern, but it still has the Ica in the middle, Nicholas. And you're just kind of hinting at it there. Again, it's not a million miles away, but you can lead yourself to that by just looking at historical comparisons, Greek tragedies, whatever it is that kind of fits into the tale you're telling. But also doing this is finding words, not so much from English, but it could be English, but you can find ones from outside of English that fit. And a great example of that, for example, is in Harry Potter, the villain Voldemort. Of course, mort being the French word for death. Is just built right in there. It's obviously the villainous character, Voldemort. It sounds nasty as you say it, and it has death built into it. You can be really, really on the nose as well, if that's how you want to go with things. One of my favorite movies is Alan Parker's Angel Heart, and Robert De Niro's character shows up in that calling himself Louis Sephir, with this really bad kind of French pronunciation at the end, which is quite clearly a totally on the nose Lucifer, which the film acts like it's some big reveal at the end, but it's like I've known the whole time, like the guy's literally the devil. But also think about how references to previous things can work. For example, historical figures or historical characters, other things that you've seen in fiction or fact. To the name can set an expectation of what the character is going to get up to. Based on that, one of the examples I always use, even though he was a real person as well, is Dr. Crippen. He was an awful murderer in real life, but my introduction to his story was noticing books and movies about Dr. Crippen. And the name, as soon as you hear it, it invokes Jack the Ripper, straight away, in my mind anyway. So you've got lots of things that go along with that, just the rip in the middle. And as soon as you hear that name, you think this is a bad person. They're not going to be up to any good. And as a writer, you can play with that. That person that you're introducing with that name doesn't have to be a bad person, but we expect it. And how are you going to play with that? How are you going to mess with me and mess with my expectations by doing that? I think it's also a really good reason why, in real life, the film director Wes Craven just had the perfect name for being a horror film director. You hear the name Wes Craven.
It really does, yeah.
Craven built into something negative.
I almost would have thought that was a stage name or a pen name because of that.
I initially would have thought it was. It's not. It was his real name, Wes Craven, and it just seems to drip with dread itself. It's wonderful. Being more on the nose with things like this as well. You have Judge Dredd in the comic books. It's made to actually have the word dread and it just spelled differently to tell you that this is not somebody to mess with. And moving into kind of other lines as well is what's going to happen, or how can I use parts of the story or kind of promise in there as the name of the character. In one of my own screenplays, I named the main character David Warnock. Specifically went with the surname Warnock because in the story he's going to go to war with the criminal underworld. It's just this guy who gets caught up in a situation and ends up going to war with criminals in the seedy underbelly of society. So I had to put that in the name, and I thought, okay, that fits. It kind of made me happy, and also having the knock at the end again is one of these harsher pronunciations, which again speaks to the depths that things were eventually going to go for him. This normal guy heading into I guess what is the archetypal heading into Hades on a mission kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it really does make a lot of sense. There's different people sometimes people look up different languages for things, like I believe C.S. Lewis with Aslan, it's like Turkish for lion or something like that. You'll find and so there you'll get the meaning, but it's a little bit varied, right? Because it's a few different ways. J.K. Rowling, you mentioned. The thing about J.K. Rowling is sometimes if you knew your Latin, you might get a little spoiled. Like Remus Lupin shows up, and then there's a big reveal where hopefully this isn't a spoiler for anybody. If it is, oh well, you had a long time to read it. He turns out
I know nothing about it, but I'm going to guess he's a werewolf.
Yes, right.
Oh, okay.
Right. And it's like a big reveal, and you're like, well, I kind of saw that coming. Although it's not like the big reveal of that book, so but this is a danger, right? When you make an allegory. Although I would imagine you can kind of use it to pull the wool over the audience's eyes, right? Because you can set up the character as an archetype that you're going to mess with, right? And then name them something that really leans into the archetype. And then the reader's like, oh, well, this is just going to be kind of a paint by numbers. And then it goes another direction. That could be kind of fun.
Yeah. I like Stephanie's comment there as well. It's kind of melds into all this, is the character labeled at birth and doomed kind of by that kind of name. And that's where you can really play with things. For example, if you build a kind of like the Icarus thing, I mentioned in the beginning, if you had a fantasy character called Icarian and everyone is watching that story and is familiar with the myth of Icarus and is kind of like, I see where this is going. This is going to be a tragedy. And we watch him the whole story kind of getting too big for his boots and it's all going to go horrendously wrong. But you soften it a little. It doesn't go the way we think it's going to go. That's the kind of way that you think, lead people to think this character is doomed, but they're not.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing you can do is even if you're not going to twist, it can just create dramatic irony, right? Where something that the character does not. And that could still be entertaining, as long as you don't think it's a big twist what happens to them, right? If you know the audience is going to be ahead of it, if you know that, then you can certainly make the inevitable disaster very interesting, right? Or, the inevitable success or whatever it is. Somebody said yes, but how many kids got that reference from J.K. Rowling? That's a very good point, right? For her audience, probably went over their head. I went over my head at the time, but yeah. Let's see. Something else said. Yeah, somebody said, is the character labeled birth and doom? I think to some degree, this whole allegorical naming, it really is very classical, right? It's like biblical in nature, where characters are given names and it basically informs their existence. And it's something that you see in like Greek mythology as well. So I think too, it kind of gives it that sort of, it gives it the sense that even like the world itself is involved in your story in a different sort of way, in my opinion. It kind of gives a larger than life feel to the work when you do it. Sometimes though that can feel a little bit too pat, like everything is too put together. So it just
Sometimes,
depends.
yeah, it's again, it's a kind of springboard to jump from. But if you start down that road and think everything is too on the nose, you're ending up with a Louis Cypher kind of
Yeah, right.
situation,
Unless
and
it's a
that's
joke or kind of
yeah,
like
unless
it's
you're
a
intending to be that way, you
yeah.
might want to pull it back and try a different method.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right, moving on. We have clever or hidden rhymes. So looking for this is getting back to the way that a name sounds, right? Seeing how they might sound in a way that makes them memorable. So what do you think about this technique, Gareth? I got
I
this
like
from
it.
you.
It's got a couple of uses. Again, it's multifaceted. This one, just like the allegorical approach, there are different angles you can come at it from. I think the first one is the simplest one. Is just think about a defining element of that character and how can you rhyme off that in the name. And of course, the first one that ever comes to me when I think of this kind of thing is Hannibal Lecter, Hannibal the Cannibal. It's actually part of the whole mythos of his
Mm,
character and how everyone refers to him because it rhymes. Hannibal the Cannibal. You think of
that's
something
true.
like that, it just works.
Yeah.
And it's straight up easy. So if there is a defining thing about them, of course, the defining element of Hannibal Lecter, besides obviously all the aspects of his character that make him who he is cannibalistic killer. So that ties right in. So think about things like that, just real easy ones.
Hmm.
And you don't have to. That doesn't mean that in your story they're going to be saying like Daniel the Spaniel. Not that you're a dog, Daniel, but it
I'm
doesn't mean it's
impressed that you
only.
found that rhyme because that's about the only thing that rhymes with my name. So I'm
Yeah,
impressed.
it's funny.
Well done.
That's not the only way you can use these things. It's just if it comes to your mind that some name could rhyme with this aspect of the character,
Hmm.
try using it. It might work.
Yeah.
You don't have to reveal it as the rhyme
Hmm.
that it is. However, there's another way of rhyming, which is not rhyming the entire word, but just rhyming some little elements of it. Find, especially if you look at, I think, the vowels in the word, you'll be able to find some decent rhymes. Um, let's say, where's my mind? If your character is a writer, look at the word writer and think about how the vowels actually stress in that word. And if you sit there and go writer, 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 a surname like Schreier might come into your mind,
Mm.
which in terms it kind of sits there and you're like, okay, so we've come into the word Schreier. And I also like to go a little further and think about what rhymes off something like that. The word Schreier, the surname Schreier, makes me think of the word scryer, like somebody who's telling the future or that kind of thing. If you can rhyme off of the name into a sort of thematic element that also fits into the story, then awesome. It's like you found it. I think that would be great. And that name would then fit kind of subconsciously just perfectly into the little jigsaw that is your story. But sit and think about rhymes for a while. If not, you'll at least entertain yourself, I think.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Some people have pointed out, and this hasn't been confirmed by the writers, but in the new movie Encanto, the main character is named Mirabelle, which they think is a rhyme to miracle, which is what she's concerned with the whole time, is saving the miracle, and her name is
Ah,
Mirabelle. Probably, I would. It seems reasonable enough, right? And again, it's just a little bit apart. You'll notice this a lot, though, if you watch some stuff in the musical form, right? Because they think about the fact that they're going to possibly have to rhyme the name and song. And so they often do think about this a lot. But to Garrett's point, even if you're not going to spell it out in the sense that somebody's going to turn to a character and be like, you're Hannibal the Cannibal or something, it doesn't mean that that's not a good way of getting to the point. It's like a clever way to, it's like a subtle way of people linking two concepts, right? Is kind of what you're going for
yeah,
because the
yeah.
sounds are similar enough. Yeah.
It helps, and I think it's not always going to happen that way. That
Mm-mm.
something that rhymes off, say, their job, is going to automatically then lead you without being super convoluted about it, into a rhyme about themes. It's just really helpful when it does. I think psychologically that's a real boon. You just go, yeah, that's it, that's going to fit, and go into that. However, it may not fit based on some of the other things we'll talk about in a minute.
I love people trying to come up with rhymes now, like Danielle smoke Galadriel and so swell Daniel. We'll say only Spaniel's a true rhyme. I'm a stickler for true rhyme. I've written musical theater though, so that's why. Jake the Rake. Yeah, that's kind of a
Schreier the liar. Sounds like we're
try.
building a Goodfellas
Yeah, feels like Monty
crew here.
Python or something. Like you could have all this stuff. All right, let's move on here. Use tools. What kind of tools are you talking about, Karen?
This is probably one of the easiest ones as well, because sometimes if you are just stuck, Google is your best friend on that front.
Yes.
Just Google online name generator.
Hmm.
There are tons and tons of them out there.
There are.
Although varying quality, some aren't the best. Reedsy actually have
I
a
love like the ones that are for specific genres because then they get so outlandish sometimes. It's
Some
just
really
really
can be.
funny.
I
Yeah.
was I was just saying, Reedsy have a pretty good one that you can break down in between
Yeah.
genre and period as well. But they have a section in their one that goes way far back, so you can go really back to like old Celtic names, and some
Hmm.
of them are just nuts. When they come up, it's like nobody's going to use anything like that nowadays because it's too much.
Yeah.
Even though they're super authentic, it's too
Right.
much. Kind of calls back to what you said earlier
Yeah,
about
about audience expectation.
audience
Right?
expectation. Yeah. However, I do recommend having a look at the Reedsy one because it's really handy. But you can Google, just fantasy character name generator, for example, and you'll find a whole load of ones that may or may not be useful, but they're pretty much at your fingertips all the time as a kind of either a jumping off point or a last ditch effort.
Yeah. And another one I like is behindthename.com. That's really good. They have a huge database, and you can search multiple ways. Language of origin. You can look for meaning. You can throw a lot of different things in the search and see what it spits back, and it can be very helpful. That's another one too. If you wanted to go back to our first point and look up something like the origin or the year or something like that, they have little charts so you can see things like that as well. But yeah, it's a helpful tool. I've used it before because I was trying to. I was stuck. One thing I like to do, this is fun, go into your email and look in your spam box because you get some very interesting names. Try that sometime. And if anything, it might just rejigger your thinking a little bit. Another tool you can do is something like Facebook, or any social media service you have. Just kind of go through your names. Don't necessarily go through the people because that's already people right? Go to their lists of their friends, and it'll give you common names in usage right now. Now, that may not work for what you're doing, right? It might not be set in the current era, but if you are setting something in the current era, that can help you as well. If anything, you can, well, I don't know if I should say this, but you could like completely steal somebody's identity because you can find them, you take the picture, you can do all that because you don't know that person, right? And then you can be like, that person's great inspiration. And that person may never know that they did that. But,
Well, then they read your book and they think, oh, I personally feel really seen in this novel.
And then they find out that you murder them later on in a graphic way. There was a writer who was talking about that. The people in his office are always like, oh, you need to put me in your book. You need to put me in your book. And then he did, and he murdered all of them. It's like, well, you asked it for it. One time I actually did have somebody do that. They were like, oh, I really want to be in your story. And I just ended up putting his name in just to be nice. He didn't have a major role, but it was fun. He was a good person. The tool's name, I believe you're referring to behindthename.com. That's what I was talking about. It's great. Ooh, pets. This is a very good point, right? What about not just naming human characters? What about animal characters or alien characters or other species? Yeah. Then you have a lot more opportunity, right?
Yeah, I like when it comes to pets, I like coming up with names for them that also have a pet name. Pet name,
Like a nickname?
like a nickname for
Yeah.
that they get referred to. We did see a question earlier when my dog started barking. Yes, my dog's name is Ridley, named after the filmmaker Ridley Scott,
I had a
and
feeling.
we call him. I just call him Riddles like all the time
Aw.
because it's just a nickname that comes off, and I think that's really great if you when you're writing, fictional pets and giving them, attaching them to characters, that the characters also have a pet name beyond the pet's actual name.
No, that's true. And this kind of goes back to the person, who was talking about in romance, what you say in the heat of passion. But yeah, that's actually something to think about as well. I don't think that's on our list, but think about how you might shorten the name, right? Uh, or let's imagine too that you want to give somebody a very alien name, like let's say they're literally an alien, right? A common tactic is the alien has some sort of long convoluted name, and then the main character is like, yeah, I could never pronounce that, so I'll just call you, and it's some cute like shortening of it. that's a way to get both things across: the authenticity that this is a collection of sounds we don't have on Earth, but yet the audience doesn't lose their mind every time they're pronounced.
And we had a little comment there from Sarah. Love using fantasy name generator to get into the swing of how the names might sound, then take some of them and alter them. Yeah, I think that's the best way to actually use generators, is to get yourself a list of things, get into the swing, how it sounds, how they feel, and make up your own from there. But of course, there's nothing wrong with just, if you find one that you think, yeah, that's perfect, I'll just take it.
Yeah, because the one thing you don't want to do with pet names or other species names is get so bizarre that the audience just gets bogged down. Because then it's annoying. Because even though we're reading it as letters, we still want to kind of sound it out in our head. So if we're always stumbling around how it's supposed to sound out loud over and over again, it's not usually a great reading experience. Although I know some people lean into that and they have unpronounceable names, and that's kind of the point. I just generally don't think that's a great idea. Yes, Gareth?
Yeah, it's too much of a stumbler, I think, those for me. But I did want to point out, I'm not sure if we highlighted Saika's. I named the cat Mr. Perkins.
Oh, yes, that's like a pun. Do we have that on our list? Puns?
I don't think we have puns on our list, but
we
pets,
should.
I approve of puns.
And depending on your audience, it could work for other things as well.
True.
It's like in the Princess Diaries movie, their neighbor is like Mr. Robitussin, which is so strange, but it's so quirky, and that's kind of the thing it is. It's a quirky coming of age story, so it works. So it depends on the tone. Obviously, a character like that, if it's a highfalutin drama, would just be like kind of off-putting and weird. But sometimes throwing in a pun like that, especially if you are writing a comedy or something a little bit eccentric, it can be a lot of fun. All right, what's our next little tip here? Pay attention to rhythm. We already talked a little bit about the sound in terms of the specific syllables, like a k sound, but what do we mean when we pay attention to the rhythm of the sound?
Yeah, how is the name actually working in rhythm, like like a drum beat, when it's actually placed inside of your writing? This is probably one of the most important, because I think you can find a really, really cool name, something you really like, but when you put it in place, nothing reads really right anymore, because the cadence, everything is off, the rhythm is pushed off. Just interestingly enough, if you look into it, I think most often a lot of the full character names, so we're talking first name and last name for leading characters, tend to either be 3 or 4 syllables. If we're talking, characters like Harry Potter, we had Silence of the Lambs there, so Clarice Starling, Jack Reacher, Luke Skywalker. Go for aliens like Ellen Ripley. They're usually 3 or 4. Of course, there are exceptions. Sometimes go a bit longer. Katniss Everdeen, for example, would be 5, I think. Katniss Everdeen. Yeah, it would be 5. Characters like that. But the majority you see popping up tend to be 3 or 4. However, you can dial back to 2 syllables, which I think really works when you want the name of your character to be forceful or lend a sense of terseness to their personality as well.
I'm curious if we have the same example in mind. Go ahead.
Well, Bruce Wayne would be one.
Oh.
I'm always going on about John Wick because it's so simple. 2 syllables, John Wick. And what does he do? He messes everybody up. James Bond.
James Bond, that was the one I thought of. Yeah, just the rhythm of the sentence. My name is Bond, James Bond. Like any other name in that sentence, with the rhythm would be totally different.
Yeah, the name's Fitzgerald. John Fitzgerald. It just doesn't come across the same way. It's not it's not punchy, not as punchy.
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
Without the rest of his name as well, in Lord of the Rings we have Gandalf. Just 2 syllables, Gandalf. And this is a super cheesy one that comes to my mind, but I'm trying to think of all these names that are really cheesy and on the nose, action type stuff. But characters like Chuck Steele, if you had that name come through, it's just, again, 2 syllables, really forceful, like Max. Like you could have like Max Steel and things like that as well, which are just cheesy names. But the 2 syllables definitely on purpose. It's just there for a punch. But
yeah, longer names do tend to sound kind of more old-fashioned in a sense. I don't know why, but I guess because when I'm thinking, I'm just trying to think in my mind of characters with long syllable names, and I'm only thinking of stuff that dates back. So maybe that's why.
Yeah, some longer names, like you could have a longer first name. Like a lot of these ones that are in the 3 or 4 category tend to be shorter first names, usually 2 syllables maximum. However, you could have a first name of a character like Delilah. which is 3 syllables. And if you want to keep that into four, then you give them a 1-syllable last name, which 1-syllable last names, again, tend to be a little more forceful. So it could be a name like Delilah Stern. And there you are. It says a little about the character, feels a little more forceful. So you put yourself into that position of how it sounds. But going back to the paying attention to rhythm, this is where it is doubly important, because having too few or too many syllables in a character name can actually throw off the rhythm of the writing, and that's something that you really don't want. When you're thinking about the rhythm, is thinking about the stresses as well. Getting down to the nitty gritty in a kind of poetic sense within the sentence is thinking about the meter, the rhythm of it. If you're writing mostly in iams, going back to a lot of poetry,
taking me back to English literature class.
I know, it's like, oh, here we go. Might be,
diagram this meter for me.
Shakespeare's preference for iambic pentameter, for example. But a lot of the iam is just, it flows nicely. The reason iambic is used a lot is because it flows, and the stress is obviously on the second beat. I am, it goes up. And how that works into your writing when you put the character name in, is that still happening? Is that same flow? Is the same stress is still there? This is one of the reasons that I think it's better to kind of get settled into your character name early before, because it can be a bit of a curse when you get to the end of a 80,000 word novel and you think, I don't like the character name anymore, I'm going to go back and change that. That can actually be a road straight to hell. If you're going to do that, I would stress to change the name, but keep it the same number of syllables overall, so that does not, when you go back and change it, all of a sudden just jumble the music of every sentence that you've written already.
That's a really good
from
point.
3 to 5 will change the whole rhythm, and everything will not sound the same. So keep the syllables in mind and pay attention to rhythm.
Somebody says, I wonder if anyone's named their child Medusa. Well, that's an interesting concept, but I do know there are characters named Medusa, not just in Greek mythology. For example, in Disney's The Rescuers, the villain is called Medusa, which is very on the nose, but it works. Yeah, no, that's really cool. The other thing too is I am, that's like you're building up, right? Because it's unstressed, stressed, right? Then there's the opposite trochee where you go down. And so depending on the way that you want the character to come across, you might do that too. Like Thomas is the other way.
Exactly right. Yeah.
But also within the sentence, right? If it's like I am, whatever, like it'll really, it tends to be naturally kind of the way we talk, and so an I am name just kind of rolls in really easily, whereas a trochee name, it kind of pulls out a little bit more.
Yeah. I think kind of paying attention to that sort of more academic part of it when it comes to the names and how they work in sentences.
We're smart around here on AutoCrit.
It's probably a good thing to do, especially for these names that have the harsh endings when you want them to really pop out of the sentence. Because like Daniel says, I think most of us tend to just kind of flow in I am. It's natural. It works that way, and people fall into it easily. But if you can drop a trochee name in the middle, it's going to stand out. You're doing something with it, and it's especially good for villains.
Now, here we go. A 1-syllable name, Groot. Yeah. And think of the one thing about that too is obviously Groot is a play on root, and it's also an ooh sound, which is very pleasant. It's cute, and it kind of rhymes with cute. So it works. Yeah. What'd you say?
And also grow, as that built into it.
Yeah. Right. So it definitely there's a lot baked into that name that works very well. But yeah, when 1-syllable names by themselves obviously land a specific way. For a character like that, that's very otherworldly, works quite well. SpongeBob SquarePants. I mean, if you want to talk about a name where there's a lot built into it in terms of like, what is this even talking about? Works really well, for the audience it's trying to get across. Very memorable, that's for sure.
And Jake, permission granted.
Jake Hawk.
Like, what are you? You got 2-syllable names. Like, what are you? Some kind of tough guy?
Exactly right. You step into it. It's like that. It is funny. It's like, are people being set up? Like, it's almost like I'd like to see some sort of psychological study. It's like, who had more schoolyard fights, for people with 2-syllable names or whatever. These are the kind of things I like to look at in my spare time. I think that's the end of our slides. Are there any other ways that you like to think of names that we have not spoken about. Obviously, lots of different things that you can do. Our hope, like we said at the very beginning, was by going through some of our methods, we might just give you some new ways of looking at it, you know, kind of shake the box a little bit, adjust your thinking, you know, different ways to approach it, because you might do a mix of them. It's not an exact science, of course. This is all very subjective. And what you often find is by just trying a mix of tools, something will just fit in and it'll be right. And you'll know it is right. And you just get, and then you get to feel satisfied about it. And it works really well.
Oh, I'm waiting for somebody to say, no, yeah, what I do is flip over a Scrabble board and check some
you
letters.
mocked my method, Gareth. It's very true. Ooh, read tombstones and obituaries. That's interesting. Yeah. Or, you know, just news in general, you know, different places where names are listed, apartment listings if you're in an apartment building with them, and all different kinds of things. Sure. Twitter bots, you know. The fun thing about stuff like that too is like they have to do the same thing, right? Anybody that's trying to pretend to be somebody, so sometimes the names they come up with, they're very entertaining, because I don't know, somehow you just feel like it's not real, because you're like, that doesn't sound like a real name somehow, because it's, I guess it's the mix of the first and last name that can be throw you. The best kind of name for the main character to use as the title. Do you mean as like their own title? Like if you bake that in? Oh, wait, this is somebody said, I think it was a response to another comment. I used to walk my fingers through a telephone book, picking a first name and matching up with a different last name. Yeah, it's kind of just like a basic brainstorming technique, right? You just go through one list and another list, and then you're like, boop, and then you see how it works.
Yeah, I think that's what a similar thing to what a lot of these online generators do nowadays. It's just all that data, click the button, and it sticks two together.
Nicknames too. People have mentioned that nicknames often do not have really any connection that's detectable from their origins, and that is something to keep in mind too in a course of a story, right? Sometimes people get the weirdest nickname for the whatever reason, like in the Office, the guy starts calling the guy Tuna because he eats a tuna sandwich like once, and that's the whole joke, is like he keeps calling him Tuna after that. You know, and that sort of stuff you can keep in mind too when it comes to character names. Is, you know, what do the other characters call them? Does everybody call them the same thing? What does that say about their character in the different way they refer to them? You know, what they abbreviate? Do they use like like a title, if you can call Tuna a title, like, or whatever, a descriptor, rather than the name? You know, that can actually be important in the picking of the name too. Yeah, especially if you can have fun with it. That's where you can find fun rhyming stuff too, right? Because, you know, the mean character could like rhyme it in a mean way and stuff like that, you know. So
yeah, nicknames can be a fun one because they can either spin off of the actual name and rhyme or make no sense whatsoever, unless context is placed upon it. And that context can be funny, like the tuna thing. It just makes no sense at all. Yet it's the kind of thing that catches on. And if you introduce something like that in a story, you know, your readers the whole time is going like, why are they referring to him as this? It's like, I need the answer to this. And then when the answer is something just plainly absurd, it would be very, very funny. But going down that same route as well, it could be that the nickname is spawned from sort of skills in high school days, or a club they were in high school days, or what was going on back then. And that can just help you round out the character as well, you know, without actually trying to be funny about it.
Yeah, it reminds me of, this is kind of a weird, this is a deep cut movie, but Herbie Goes Bananas, which is a Disney movie where the car is called Herbie, but it has a 53 in the front, and so the kid keeps calling him Ocho because they're in Mexico, and they're like, why do you keep calling him Ocho? He's like, well, 5 and 3 is 8. Everybody knows that. But the whole movie, you're like, why is he calling him Ocho? I have no idea what that means. It's really funny. Somebody said, don't be afraid to, Ron, I love Ron. Hi, Ron. Don't be afraid to use names from other cultures to add variety. That is something to be said, right? When you look at your whole cast list together, you're kind of giving a picture of what this world is, who people are connecting with, and things like that. So yeah, if all the names sound like they come from the same region of the world, and this takes place in New York City, it's not going to seem very realistic, right? Because that's a very multicultural society. On the other hand, if this is set in the island in the middle of who knows where, and all their names kind of sound similar to each other, well, that would make sense because this is a more isolated society. So yeah, you have to keep that in mind, because otherwise, or people might be thinking you're making some sort of statement about, the type of people your characters connect with, and that's not something you tend to do at all. You just weren't thinking outside the box in terms of the type of people that they would interact with on a regular basis. So yeah, something to keep in mind for sure. I met a woman named Cinnamon, so I took that name, developed a character. Yeah, it can be. People do get inventive with names. They will have unusual names, and then you can say, "Hey, that's kind of interesting," and I like it. And then you can decide to use it. Of course, now that person knows you did, so ha ha ha. They're gonna sneak and find you. Hopefully, you were nice to Cinnamon, whatever your character was. George Foreman, yes, named his children George 1, George 2. Yes, he did. He's very famous for that. But again, imagine you have a character like that. That does tell you something about them, right? It's a little bit of an insight for sure. I have a character called Barry because of his strawberry red hair. He got that nickname when he was young. Well, that's nice. And, that's the opposite of Tuna. That's a nickname that actually makes logical sense. All right, so
I'll call it Jim's one. Yeah, perfect kind of application of the allegorical thing that we started with.
Oh yes,
look at different languages as well for it. Yeah, cheat, sure, German, Schumeln. So you don't need to necessarily use the actual word, but try to then spawn off of it. So surname Schumer. There you go. You're starting to bake that in. Cheat in French. I'm not sure. My French is not great. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. Tricare. I don't know. And what can you do with that? So maybe you can work off the TRI, fill some names off the end of that, and attach those to the characters, and just bake the message right in there. They're a walking allegory for the person that they are. And it's really cool. Just looking through all different languages to find those springboards is fun.
This is a good point. A name that's also a title. Yeah, sometimes you will think of the fact that you want to make the main character name also the title of the work, or who the character, not necessarily the main character, but maybe what the story is about. Either like the MacGuffin character or like the main character, the character everyone's focused on. Like Peter Pan, right? That is also the title of it, and I believe it was chosen for a reason. Pan is is not only the person who plays the pipes, but Pan is everything, right? And like Peter Pan kind of represents the childhood ambition to want to be anything, and not want to settle down into a form as an adult, not to get too literary on you, but you know what I mean? So I think it comes across in the title itself. Short for sure. Somebody said actually no, a job title. I'm sorry, I've completely missed your point. But hopefully you like that. But yes, a job title like king, whatever, queen, whatever. There you're gonna have to think of the rhythm as well, to Garrett's point, right? If their job title is part of the rhythm of their name, then you may want to adjust what the name sounds like based on the job title. Right, because if it's like Inspector, you might want it. There's a reason why I think inspectors often have like one syllable name: Inspector Brown, Inspector whatever, because inspector's kind of long, right?
And a lot of these kind of things coming through the jobs as well. Again, think about the rhythm. Think about the syllables and everything that goes into those. The most iconic tend to be 3 or 4. If we're going into, because when you said the titles there, and I think Anne called it out right away as soon as I thought it was Doc. A character like, for example, Doc Holliday. If you're going into the Western side of things, Doc Holliday, four syllables, leads you to Billy the Kid, 4 syllables. They all kind of walk along those lines, and it's easy to just run them off your mouth, and you remember them so easily that way. But think about the rhythm when it comes to them, and if they do have a title, that it could be better in terms of the rhythm of your writing, that other characters refer to them by their title and name. For example, Queen Elizabeth, let's just say, that they always say Queen whatever, rather than using the actual name. Well, then, do that. Tends to be a nice one. But you can refer to people. And, remember historical surnames as well. A lot of those come from the jobs. Surnames like Baker are literally bakers.
Yeah. It's like, wow, that kind of makes sense. But yes, sometimes it does. For sure. Yeah, one kind of quirky thing about the English language is how many of our names don't have intrinsic meaning, which is not always the case in other languages, right? Like we'll have names like Daisy or Hope or things like that, but a lot of them are more the syllabic sounds. And yes, they have a meaning, but they're an import from another language. And so in English, they don't inherently have a meaning. So it is kind of interesting quirk. We're not the only language like that, but it is an interesting quirk of our language, which I think for artists kind of gives you some fun tools to play with, like we were talking about.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it as well. That said, with the historical sort of push through or cut through of surnames and how they evolve and where they naturally come from, I think a lot of those ones like Baker that were literally just your job role applied to you as a surname tend to come from medieval times, I think, and evolve from there. But if you move across to somewhere like some of the Scandinavian countries, they'll have surnames like Thorgensen, a lot of son attached on the end, and it's usually the name of the sort of founder of the lineage and son literally spawn of. So keep an eye on that, and that's something that you can introduce to your own fantastical lines as well. Maybe they do something similar to that builds surnames.
Yeah, it does say something about, especially if you're talking about like fantasy or sci-fi or something where you're establishing world building, how they name themselves obviously says a lot. I think of an extreme example, but the THX1138, right, where you're just given a code and a number, right, and that tells you something about that society right off the top of the bat, right? You could say on the nose, but it does, in comparison to a society where people honor their ancestors with their name, which is different than people picking abstract concepts. You know what I mean? So it can tell you a lot about the culture around you. So pay attention to that in terms of your world building, especially if you're writing an unusual place that's not typical day.
And there could be things like the question of what's in a name. I think a nice kind of concept for some fantasy settings are what if you're not allowed a surname? What if that's an honor?
Right.
To have it, and what if it's taken from you? What does that mean? So you have characters who are walking around, like we had some questions earlier about what about characters with only one name? What if only having one name actually meant something in the society in your story? And what would you do to restore that honor of your full name?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as people say, sometimes family names uses first names. Yep. Main character uses the father name for his son's middle name. Yeah, one of my sons is named after some family members. So yeah, definitely a practice that people do for sure. Well, do you think we've pretty much exhausted names, Gareth?
I think enough to start making some.
Making a name for ourselves, I hope. Yes, that's the whole goal, right? We don't want to just stay here chatting all day long, because you need to get back to writing. Hopefully you have some great ideas. I'm sure you do, and you're just anxious to get started brainstorming some characters, brainstorming some names. Perhaps we might make you rethink some of your choices in terms of names based on rhythm or things like that. So let's time to get back to work, or more importantly, the fun of writing. So I thank you, Gareth, for sharing your thoughts. Very interesting, as always.
Been a pleasure.
And we will be back next week at 1 o'clock Eastern for another live stream. So please like, subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you around on AutoCrit.
Thanks for coming, everybody. See you next time.
Bye, everybody.